There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them. It lives in sepia photographs, in the language of memorials, in the phrase "the war to end all wars." It is a version built from distance, from the safe remove of a century, from the careful curation of what was allowed to be said, what was permitted to be printed, and what the governments of 5 empires decided their civilian populations were stable enough to hear. That version is incomplete, not because the facts were lost, but because the facts were buried. Some of them literally, some of them in filing cabinets, in classified medical reports, in letters that were opened and censored before they ever reached the people they were addressed to. Some of them in the silence of men who came home and never spoke again about what they had seen. This is not a story about heroism. It is not a story about sacrifice in the way that word is usually used. This is a story about what happens when industrial civilization turns its full organizational power toward the single purpose of killing human beings at scale, and what the people caught inside that machine quietly learned to accept as normal, not because they were broken, not because they were weak, but because the alternative to acceptance was a kind of cognitive rupture that the mind could not survive intact. Acceptance was the only available technology for endurance. The war began in the summer of 1914 with a speed that surprised nearly everyone. By the autumn of that year, the Western Front had already collapsed into stalemate. 2 enormous armies, each possessing industrial-era firepower but 19th-century tactical thinking, dug into the ground across a line that would shift only a few miles in either direction for the next 4 years. The trench system that resulted was not a single ditch. It was a parallel universe, a subterranean civilization stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Hundreds of miles of interconnected tunnels, fire steps, dugouts, communication trenches, reserve lines, and support positions. Men lived inside this system for weeks at a time. They ate in it. They slept in it. They developed infections in it. They lost their minds inside it. And they died inside it in numbers that the human brain, even now, struggles to process. The first practice that soldiers quietly accepted was the normalization of living among the dead. This was not a poetic statement. It was a physical reality of daily existence on the Western Front. When men died in the trenches, their bodies were not always retrievable. A man killed on the fire step might remain there for days, propped against the trench wall, becoming something else, changing in texture and smell and color, while his former comrades ate their bully beef 3 feet away. When artillery shells churned the earth, the bodies of men previously buried in shallow graves were frequently disinterred and pushed back to the surface. This meant that the walls of the trenches were sometimes composed in part of human remains. Boots with feet still inside them were a common sight. Hands protruding from the earth were so unremarkable that soldiers used them as hooks to hang equipment. A soldier writing home was not permitted to describe this. A censor would remove it. But the men who were there described it in private diaries and in letters written after the war, and what emerges from those accounts is not horror in the literary sense. What emerges is routine. The body of the man who had been your friend was now part of the landscape. You navigated around it. Eventually, you stopped seeing it. The scale of unrecovered dead across the Western Front was enormous. At the Battle of the Somme alone, the first day produced nearly 60,000 British casualties. Many of those men fell in no man's land, the strip of ground between the opposing trenches, where no rescue party could reach them without being killed in turn. They remained there. The ground of the Somme still yields human remains today. Among French troops killed in the war, the bodies of nearly half of the approximately 1.5 million dead were categorized as either missing or entirely unidentifiable. What that statistic means, translated into human terms, is that hundreds of thousands of men were simply consumed by the war itself, dissolved by artillery, submerged in mud, scattered beyond reconstruction. The Gate Memorial in Ypres carries the names of nearly 55,000 men who died in the Ypres salient and who have no known grave. That is not a memorial to the unburied. That is a monument to the unfindable. The second practice that soldiers accepted was the coexistence of their daily lives with rats. Not the kind of rats that appear in passing briefly to establish atmosphere. The kind that numbered in the millions. The kind that had been breeding undisturbed for years on the most nutrient-rich substrate imaginable. There were estimates at the time, and they are corroborated by post-war accounts, suggesting that there were more rats in the trenches than there were soldiers. The rats were large. Accounts routinely described them as being the size of cats, swollen and slow from their diet. They were also bold in a way that animals fed on abundance become bold. They would move across sleeping men's faces without hesitation. They would drag rations from a soldier's hands. They would gnaw through leather equipment. They were active primarily at night when the men were trying to rest, so that the attempt to sleep became a constant negotiation with the knowledge that the animals were there, in the dark, moving across you and around you. The rat's relationship to the human dead was something that soldiers described with the particular flatness of men recounting something they had processed past the point of effect. The rats consumed the bodies in the open. They entered them. One account, recorded and preserved from the period, described a soldier discovering a body during a patrol and watching rats scatter from beneath the dead man's coat, the coat still heaving as they moved inside it, the face beneath already stripped. That account was not published during the war. Soldiers were prohibited from keeping diaries in many cases, and their letters were censored by officers who understood that descriptions of this kind, if they reached the home front, might damage civilian willingness to continue supporting the war. So the knowledge stayed in the trenches. It became part of the private common understanding of the men who were there, a shared vocabulary of experience that had no equivalent in the language available to them from the world they had left. The military attempted to address the rat problem. They offered financial incentives for rat tails. The French army promised small cash bonuses per tail presented to the quartermaster's office. They deployed terriers. They contracted professional rat catchers. None of it made a meaningful difference. The conditions that produced the rats, the abundance of unrecovered dead, the food scraps, the standing water, the miles of undisturbed underground burrows, those conditions did not change. The rats were a structural feature of trench warfare. Soldiers learned to sleep through them. They learned to keep their food sealed in tins. They learned that shooting rats wasted ammunition and drew punishment from sergeants who caught them. They adapted. This adaptation was its own kind of cost, invisible in the casualty figures, unrecorded in the medical reports. The third practice was living with lice. The body louse was universal on the Western Front. Every soldier had them. Every uniform harbored them. They lived in the seams of clothing, in the folds of collars, in the scalp. They bit continuously, and their bites left clusters of red welts across the body. The itching was described as maddening, particularly in summer, when the warmth accelerated their activity and the inability to scratch without seeming undignified created its own particular tension. Soldiers learned to run a candle flame along the seams of their clothing, listening for the small popping sound that meant a louse or its eggs had been killed. This process was called chatting, which gives some indication of how normalized it had become. It was a social activity. Men sat in their dugouts running candles along their shirts together, talking, making the best of a situation that was permanent and inescapable. What was less often discussed was what the lice were transmitting. Trench fever, caused by the bacterium Bartonella quintana and spread through the feces of body lice, was responsible for roughly 20% of admissions to casualty clearing stations by 1917. It was not fatal as a rule, but it was debilitating. It produced fever, severe bone pain, and a period of recovery lasting several months. A soldier who contracted trench fever was effectively removed from the front line for that duration. What is significant is that the connection between lice and trench fever was not established by doctors until 1918, which means that for most of the war, the men suffering from it had no explanation for why they were ill and no means of prevention beyond what they were already doing, which was failing. The lice were everywhere, the fever moved with them, and the men who recovered were returned to the trenches, where the lice were waiting. The fourth practice was the management of trench foot. This is an injury that belongs to a specific set of conditions, and those conditions were present in the Western Front trenches almost continuously. Trench foot develops when feet are kept wet and cold for extended periods. The blood circulation to the extremities is compromised. The skin begins to break down. The tissues become vulnerable to fungal and bacterial infection. In severe cases, the skin and underlying tissue die entirely, and amputation becomes the only option. Over 74,000 British soldiers suffered from trench foot during the war. The mechanism of the injury was straightforward to understand and, in principle, to prevent. Feet needed to be kept dry, socks needed to be changed. This was military medical doctrine from 1914 onward. The problem was that it was not always possible. In sections of the line where the water table was high, where the drainage was poor, where the rain had fallen continuously for weeks, the trenches flooded to knee height. The standard British Army ammunition boot was leather. Leather is not waterproof under sustained immersion. Men stood in water for shifts of hours at a time, 4 days at a stretch, and there were no dry socks to change into because the dry socks had been soaked by the same water that had soaked the boots. Orders requiring soldiers to apply whale oil grease to their feet to prevent the condition were sometimes enforced. They were sometimes impossible to fulfill because there was no whale oil. So the men stood in the water. Their feet swelled and went numb. The numbness was, in one sense, a relief from the earlier pain. It was also the stage at which the tissue had already begun to die. Soldiers who reported trench foot were sometimes reprimanded for failing to care for their own equipment, which in the administrative logic of the British Army at the time classified feet as equipment. The injury was categorized alongside neglect of kit. This created a disincentive to report it. Men walked on feet in early stages of breakdown because reporting the condition risked disciplinary action. By the time the condition was reported, because it could no longer be concealed, it was often in an advanced state. The Army's response to this dynamic was to eventually implement a system of mutual foot inspection, in which officers were required to examine their men's feet regularly. This improved the early detection rate. It did not change the conditions that produced the injury. The fifth practice was learning to eat in conditions that would have rendered food inedible by any peacetime standard. Rations on the Western Front varied considerably by period and nationality, but the general trajectory across the war was deterioration. In the early years, British soldiers received a daily allocation that included meat, bread, tea, and tinned goods such as Maconochie stew, a canned preparation of beef and vegetables that soldiers ate cold when no heat was available, which was often. As the German submarine blockade tightened and the war dragged into its second and third years, the meat ration was progressively cut. By 1916, it had dropped to 6 ounces per day. By certain periods later in the war, men in the rear areas received meat on only 9 days out of 30. At the front, supply lines could be disrupted by enemy fire for days at a time. Harry Patch, who served in the machine gun corps and survived the war to become its last surviving British veteran, described periods when rations did not come forward at all, and the 5 men of his gun team shared whatever remained equally among themselves. The food that did arrive was frequently unpleasant, independent of the conditions in which it was consumed. The hard biscuits issued as emergency ration components were notorious. They were baked to such density that biting into them, unsoftened, risked cracking teeth. Men soaked them in water or in tea when tea was available, which softened them into a paste that could be swallowed. Water itself was often transported to the front in containers that had previously held petroleum, giving it a persistent chemical taste that no amount of tea could entirely mask. Soldiers ate their meals sitting in the mud, in the cold, often wearing the same clothes they had worn for weeks, in close proximity to the smells that were endemic to trench life. The smell of standing water, of unwashed bodies, of the chemical compounds produced by decomposing organic matter, and of the latrines. Appetite adapted. Men ate because they needed to eat. The circumstances of the meal became irrelevant. This was not resilience in the motivational sense of the word. This was the body overriding the mind's objections because hunger produces its own imperatives. The sixth practice was managing the psychological consequences of constant artillery bombardment without any official acknowledgement that such consequences existed. The modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder, of the neurological effects of repeated blast exposure, of the way that chronic fear and shock alter brain chemistry and structure, none of that existed in 1914. What existed was the expectation that a soldier would endure whatever the war required of him and would continue to function. If he failed to continue functioning, this was widely interpreted as a character deficiency, as weakness, as cowardice. The term that emerged to describe what was happening to men subjected to prolonged artillery bombardment was shell shock, coined early in the war by a British Army medical officer who initially believed the condition had a physical cause related to the concussive effects of nearby explosions on the brain. By 1916, following the Battle of the Somme, which produced the highest rates of psychological breakdown seen to that point, the term was in widespread medical and popular use. The condition manifested in a range of ways. Some men experienced tremors, paralysis, blindness, mutism, and other conversion symptoms with no apparent physical cause. Others could not stop shaking. Others stared without responding to questions. Others ran without direction. Others simply stopped being able to perform basic functions. The Army's response to this was not consistent. Some medical officers recognized that the men were genuinely ill. Some commanding officers categorized the same men as malingerers or cowards. Treatment was inconsistent, ranging from rest and recovery for officers to electric shock therapy for enlisted men. A treatment that was presented as medical, but was functionally indistinguishable from punishment. In 1917, the British Army banned shell shock as a formal diagnosis entirely. Mentions of it were censored even in medical journals. This was not because the Army believed the condition did not exist. It was because the Army believed that allowing the diagnosis to stand would spread it. There was a genuine concern among military authorities that if men understood that psychological breakdown was recognized and permitted, they would break down. The ban on the diagnosis meant that men who were suffering from what we would now recognize as severe combat stress disorder were officially classified as having no diagnosable condition. Their symptoms were therefore either physically unexplained and potentially evidence of malingering, or they were classified under euphemistic terms that avoided the implication of psychological trauma. Men who could not function due to the psychological effects of war were returned to the trenches when they were deemed to have recovered, which in the context of 1917 military medicine meant when they were able to stand up and respond to questions. The seventh practice, connected directly to this, was the tacit understanding among soldiers that they could not speak about what they were experiencing in any language that would be recognized by the men sending them forward. Letters home were censored by officers. Diaries were technically prohibited in many units, though many men kept them anyway and concealed them. What could not be censored was the face-to-face conversation between soldiers who had seen the same things, and in those conversations, a private language developed. A language of understatement, of oblique reference, of dark humor used as a pressure valve. The men who have left accounts from the front describe a quality of communication among frontline soldiers that was dense with implication and thin on explanation, because explanation was unnecessary. Everyone already knew, and what everyone knew could not be communicated outward, to the people at home who did not know, because the words for it did not exist in a form that could cross the gap between the two worlds. One of the stranger consequences of this is that many of the men who survived the war carried specific knowledge that they never transmitted to anyone. It died with them. The institutional suppression of that knowledge was so complete, and the survivors' own reluctance to revisit it so absolute, that entire dimensions of the frontline experience were simply not recorded. The eighth practice was accepting the presence of gas as a permanent atmospheric variable. Before the morning of April 22, 1915, poison gas had been a theoretical weapon, discussed in military planning but not deployed at scale on the Western Front. On that morning, German forces released approximately 150 tons of chlorine gas from 6,000 cylinders along a 4-mile front near Ypres in Belgium. The gas formed a greenish-yellow cloud and drifted across the Allied positions on the prevailing wind. The French colonial troops holding that section of the line had no protection, no warning, and no framework for understanding what was happening to them. The chlorine gas, heavier than air, flowed into the low ground and into the trenches. It reacted with moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Men drowned on dry land. The survivors ran. The gap opened by the attack should have been exploited to devastating effect. The German forces were not prepared for the scale of their own success and advanced cautiously, allowing the breach to be sealed. But what had been demonstrated was not lost on anyone. Both sides immediately began developing their own chemical weapons programs. Within months, the gas cloud had been supplemented by gas shells, which could be delivered without dependence on favorable wind conditions. The range of available agents expanded. Phosgene, which smelled faintly of cut hay and was nearly colorless, was introduced by the Germans in late 1915. It was approximately 6 times more lethal than chlorine and had the additional quality of a delayed effect. A man exposed to a non-immediately fatal dose of phosgene might feel little beyond mild irritation at the moment of exposure. Within 24 to 48 hours, his lungs would fill with fluid and he would die by asphyxiation. The delay made triage and treatment nearly impossible. By the time the severity of the exposure was apparent, the physiological damage was complete. Mustard gas arrived in July of 1917, deployed by German forces against British troops near Ypres. It was different from the earlier agents in a way that made it particularly insidious. It was not primarily a killing agent. It was designed to incapacitate and to persist. Mustard gas was a vesicant, meaning it caused chemical burns on contact with skin. It penetrated clothing. It contaminated the ground on which it had been deployed for days or weeks after its initial use. A soldier moving through a previously gassed area, hours or days later, with no alarm having sounded and no cloud visible, could still be absorbing enough agent through his skin to produce severe burns, blindness, and injury to the lungs and throat. The first symptom was typically mild irritation of the eyes. The real damage came hours later when blisters appeared on the skin, particularly in the moist areas of the body, and when the injury to the respiratory tract became apparent. Of the approximately 180,000 British chemical casualties, it was estimated that 120,000 had been subjected specifically to mustard gas. By the end of the war, gas shells constituted approximately a third of all artillery ammunition used by the French and German armies, and roughly a quarter of British and American supplies. Soldiers learned to sleep with their gas masks within arm's reach. Gas alarm systems, consisting of bells, gongs, and empty shell casings hung on wires and struck with rifle butts, were standard features of every section of trench. Men learned to identify agents by smell: chlorine like bleach, phosgene like hay, mustard like garlic or horseradish. This olfactory education was one of the stranger forms of knowledge that the war produced. Knowing what was killing you did not change the fact that it was killing you, but it changed what kind of death it was and how quickly countermeasures could be deployed. The gas mask became the most essential piece of personal equipment a soldier carried. A soldier who could not reach his mask in the 6 to 10 seconds available after an alarm sounded might not survive the next few minutes. Men drilled with their masks. They slept with them. They learned eventually to put them on in the dark in under 10 seconds. This skill had no application outside of the war. The 9th practice was the quiet accommodation of self-inflicted wounds. This is a subject that military authorities on all sides spent considerable energy suppressing, and that has consequently been underrepresented in official histories. A self-inflicted wound was a deliberate injury, most commonly to the hand or foot, that was severe enough to require medical evacuation from the front line. Men who were caught with self-inflicted wounds faced court-martial and the possibility of execution. The act was classified as a capital offense under British military law. Despite this, it happened with enough frequency that it was a recognized phenomenon, tracked in medical records and discussed in command documents. The men who did it were not cowards in any straightforward sense of the word. Many of them had served for months or years before reaching the point at which the calculus shifted and a bullet through the hand began to seem like the rational choice. It was a transaction, certain injury now, certain removal from the front line, probable survival, potential court-martial in exchange for another tour in the line, another morning standing to, another artillery bombardment, another assault across open ground toward Wire. The medical officers who treated these wounds were sometimes required to document whether a wound appeared self-inflicted. The difficulty was that in the conditions of trench warfare, a genuine wound from enemy fire and a self-inflicted wound could be difficult to distinguish, and many medical officers, confronted with a badly injured man, chose not to investigate too carefully. This was a form of institutional mercy that existed in the gap between the written policy and the human reality of its implementation. The men who received these quiet exemptions from further scrutiny did not advertise them. The men who made the determination looked away. Both parties understood what was happening, and neither acknowledged it. This was the logic of the front line distilled into a single transaction. Survival was the primary value, and everything else was paperwork. The 10th practice was participating in the live and let live system, which was one of the most extraordinary collective acts of informal negotiation in the history of warfare, and one of the least discussed in official accounts. The live and let live system was not a formal arrangement. There were no written agreements. There were no officers on either side who would have acknowledged that it existed, let alone endorsed it. What it was, in practice, was a mutually understood set of behaviors by which soldiers on opposing sides agreed, without ever speaking the agreement aloud, to reduce the lethality of the war they were conducting against each other during the periods between major offensives. Mealtimes were often tacitly observed. If one side began shelling the other's kitchens or ration parties, both sides understood that retaliation in kind would follow, and that both sides would then eat cold food. So the kitchens were left alone. Relief rotations, the movement of fresh troops into the front line, were similarly observed. A unit moving along the communication trenches toward the front line was a target that a skilled sniper could have engaged. Often it was not engaged because the opposite side would face the same exposure in a few days. The live and let live system existed because the men at the front had discovered something that the generals behind the lines would not accept. That they and their enemies were not natural enemies at all. They were industrial workers engaged in the same miserable production process, serving the same institutional machine, subjected to the same conditions, and finding in the shared recognition of that situation the basis for a provisional, unofficial, unacknowledged détente. When the informal ceasefires were interrupted by major offensives ordered from above, both sides returned to killing each other at full capacity. When the offensives ended and the lines settled again, the informal arrangements reasserted themselves, reconstructed from scratch, without coordination, simply because they served the immediate interests of everyone at the operational level. Senior command on both sides was aware that this was happening and was actively hostile to it. Raids were ordered on the front line specifically to disturb whatever equilibrium had been reached, to reintroduce lethality, to prevent the men on either side from developing any identification with their enemies. The Christmas truce of 1914, in which German and British soldiers met in no man's land, exchanged gifts and played football in some sectors, was the most famous instance of this impulse made visible, and it disturbed the officers who observed it. In subsequent years, the High Command on both sides took explicit steps to ensure it could not happen again. Artillery bombardments were scheduled for Christmas. Raids were planned and ordered. The informal human connection that had appeared in the silence of the Western Front on Christmas morning in 1914 was recognized as a threat to the operational logic of the war and was systematically suppressed in every subsequent year until the armistice. The 11th practice was the acceptance of noise as a physiological condition. This is not metaphorical. The artillery bombardments of the First World War operated at decibel levels and sustained durations that caused direct physical damage to hearing and to neurological function. The bombardment that preceded the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916, lasted 7 days. Heavy artillery fired continuously for that entire period. The noise was audible across the English Channel in southern England. Men who lived through preparatory bombardments of that kind described an alteration in perception that went beyond ordinary loudness. The concussive waves from large-caliber shells passing overhead physically moved the air in the lungs. The explosions of shells landing nearby temporarily disrupted vision and coordination. Men went deaf. Some of the deafness was temporary. Some of it was permanent. Men who survived the war came home unable to hear properly and spent the rest of their lives in a partial silence that was the war's final quiet insult. But beyond the direct physical damage, there was the psychological effect of sustained exposure to noise that was entirely outside the range of any previous human experience. The brain processes sound as information. At sufficient volume and duration, it stops processing it as information and begins responding to it as threat. The nervous system enters and does not leave an alarm state. Sleep becomes impossible, not because the noise prevents it, but because the body refuses to commit to unconsciousness in conditions it has correctly identified as immediately lethal. Men slept in fragments, in the moments between bombardments, in the dugouts that provided the illusion of shelter, but whose thin timber ceilings would not have survived a direct hit. They learned to sleep through noise that would have been incomprehensible to a person who had not been there. They learned this because the alternative was permanent sleeplessness, which was its own path to breakdown. The adaptation was real. The cost of the adaptation was real. Neither was recorded as a medical outcome in any systematic way. The 12th practice was navigating the military justice system of courts-martial and executions conducted by one's own army. Between the beginning of the war in 1914 and the armistice in November 1918, the British military tried approximately 200,000 of its own soldiers by court-martial. Of those, roughly 20,000 were convicted of offences carrying the death penalty. 3,080 received death sentences. 346 of those sentences were carried out. These numbers are for British and Commonwealth forces alone, and they represent only the officially recorded executions. The offences that most commonly resulted in execution were desertion and cowardice, which in the language of military law meant either leaving one's post without orders or failing to perform one's duty in the face of the enemy. In modern psychiatric understanding, both of these behaviors are among the most common manifestations of acute and chronic combat stress disorder. The executions were conducted by firing squads drawn from the condemned man's own regiment. This was policy. It was understood that making a man's comrades the instrument of his death created a stronger deterrent effect than using strangers. It was also understood, because it was explicit in the reasoning of commanders who wrote about the practice, that the men who had served alongside the condemned would carry the memory of what they had been required to do, and that this memory would reinforce their own willingness to remain in place under fire. The calculation was acknowledged openly in some command documents. The fear of execution, it was stated, played an important role in keeping soldiers in the field under conditions they might otherwise have fled. One brigadier general wrote after the war that he would not have wished to command even the finest army in the world without the power that the fear of execution provided. The men who were executed were often very young. Some were in their late teens. Some had served without incident for months or years before the moment that broke them. Some had been wounded previously. Many showed symptoms that would today be recognized immediately as psychiatric emergencies. At their trials, most were not provided with adequate legal representation. Many chose to speak in their own defense, which in a court-martial with officers sitting in judgment was not the same as having a lawyer argue on their behalf. The proceedings were brief. The appeals were cursory. In at least one documented case, a man was executed within 24 hours of his sentence being confirmed before his family had been notified. His mother received a letter telling her that her son had died in the line of duty. This was the official language. It was also the official lie. The French executed approximately 650 soldiers during the war. The Italians shot roughly 750. The Austro-Hungarian figure was staggering. Of 1,175 death sentences handed down by Austro-Hungarian courts-martial, 1,148 men were actually shot, a 98% execution rate against the condemned. The logic behind this, when examined, appears to be the particular fragility of an empire fighting a war it did not have the social cohesion to sustain. The executions were not deterrents in any strategic sense. They were an attempt to hold together an army that was already coming apart through the application of terminal force to the symptoms of its disintegration. The 13th practice was learning to function inside the derangement of the trench raid. The trench raid was an operational concept developed early in the war and institutionalized over time as a means of maintaining what commanders called an offensive spirit in the line during the long periods between major battles. A trench raid was a small-scale, typically nighttime assault by a party of soldiers, sometimes as few as a dozen men, sometimes several hundred, across no man's land and into the enemy's front-line trenches. The objective was to kill enemy soldiers, take prisoners for intelligence purposes, destroy enemy positions, and demonstrate to both sides that the front was active. Raids were ordered regularly. They were often extremely costly relative to their results. The men who conducted raids did so in conditions of near total darkness, across ground that had been shelled into a moonscape of craters and obstacles, through wire that had to be cut in advance, often in mud that pulled at every step. Enemy sentries who could not be seen would fire at sounds. Artillery on both sides would respond to the raid with counter-battery fire and defensive barrages that killed the men conducting the raid as readily as the men defending against it. A raid that succeeded in reaching the enemy trenches resolved into close-quarters fighting in narrow spaces, in the dark, with knives and clubs and bayonets and grenades, a form of violence that was medieval in its intimacy despite the surrounding industrial context. Men who survived raids returned having killed at close range, having seen things that no amount of training had prepared them for, and were expected to return to normal routine immediately. There was no provision in the British Army of 1916 or 1917 for any form of psychological transition between the experience of a trench raid and the resumption of ordinary duties. Men came back. They were counted. The wounded were sent to the aid post. The dead were noted in the morning report. Life continued. The men who had just killed someone at arm's length ate their breakfast and stood their watch and wrote their letters. And if they appeared disturbed, if their hands shook, or they could not speak or they stared, this was noticed and variously interpreted by their officers. And sometimes it was understood, and sometimes it was not. And the difference between those two outcomes was often the difference between a man surviving the war intact enough to go home and a man being added to the casualty. Roll under a category that, in 1917, officially did not exist. The 14th practice was the physical management of the body's decay in the absence of adequate sanitation. The trench latrines were pits dug in specific sections of the rear trenches and covered with a board with a hole in it. They were regularly overwhelmed by the scale of their use. They were targets for enemy artillery, since shelling latrines was a reliable method of inflicting misery without expending significant ordnance. They were breeding grounds for the flies that were themselves a significant factor in the spread of disease. In conditions of active bombardment or when a particular section of trench was under sustained fire, the latrines were inaccessible, and men used wherever they could, which added to the general contamination of the trench environment. Dysentery was endemic. Men who were suffering from it had no reliable means of managing its symptoms and no option of removing themselves from duty. They remained in the line and conducted their functions and returned to their posts. This is stated plainly in medical records from the period. It was simply the condition, the skin conditions that resulted from weeks of wearing the same clothing, of bathing infrequently or not at all, of living in an environment of pervasive moisture and organic decay, were numerous and largely untreated during service at the front. Trench mouth, a painful infection of the gums caused by bacteria thriving in conditions of poor oral hygiene and chronic stress, was common enough to have a name. Men lost teeth in the trenches, not to enemy action, but to the progressive deterioration of dental health in conditions where a toothbrush was a luxury and dental care was not available. The body's gradual physical deterioration was a background condition of frontline life, something that accumulated over the months and years of service, invisible in any given week, but total in its effect over time. The 15th practice was accepting the medical reality of gas gangrene. The Western Front ran across northern France and Belgium, over ground that had been intensively farmed for centuries. Agricultural land was fertilized with manure, and manure contains Clostridium perfringens, the bacterium responsible for gas gangrene, which had been present in the soil for generations. The war disrupted this soil continuously. Artillery shells churned it to a depth of several feet. Trenches cut into it. Men fell into it wounded, their injuries contaminated with the most bacterially rich dirt in Europe. Gas gangrene was not the same as the poison gases used in chemical warfare. It was a bacterial infection that spread through wound tissue, producing gas as a metabolic byproduct. The tissue went black. It smelled catastrophically. The gas accumulating beneath the skin gave it a crackling quality when pressed. The infection moved fast. Amputation, if it happened quickly enough and took enough tissue, could stop it. If it did not happen quickly enough, the infection reached the trunk and killed within hours. In the early months of the war, before the medical corps had adapted to the specific challenge of heavily contaminated wounds in heavily manured soil, gas gangrene killed more than 12% of the British soldiers who were wounded. By 1918, through the development of rapid wound debridement, improved evacuation procedures, and the systematic removal of all devitalized tissue from wounds before they were closed, this rate had fallen to less than 1%. The reduction was one of the genuine medical achievements of the war, but the 12% figure of 1914 represented a mass of individual men who survived the initial wounding, who were carried to the aid post, who were treated and believed they had survived, and who then died days later in agony as their tissue turned black and their bodies were consumed by bacteria from the ground beneath their feet. The war was in the ground they stood on. They had always been walking on what would kill them. The 16th practice was performing the daily ritual of stand to with the full knowledge of what it meant. Stand to was the twice daily procedure in which every soldier in the front line mounted the fire step before dawn, and at dusk stood with his rifle ready and watched no man's land. The logic was sound. Dawn and dusk were the most likely times for enemy assault, when the changing light gave an attacker the best cover for the initial advance. During stand-to, officers moved along the line, inspected the men, and checked that weapons were in order. Stand-to lasted until full daylight or full darkness had established itself and the risk of assault was deemed reduced. Then the men stood down and went about their duties. For the men conducting stand-to on the Somme in the autumn of 1916 or at Passchendaele in the autumn of 1917, the fire step was a particular kind of location. It was where men had been shot by snipers. It was where men had been killed by shell fire. It was where men stood with their heads above the parapet of the trench and could be seen. Standing to was standing in the place where your predecessors had been killed, in the light that made you visible, performing the ritual acknowledgement that you were still in the war. It was conducted twice a day, every day, whether or not there had been an assault the previous night, whether or not the man standing next to you was the same man who had been there yesterday. It was one of the mechanisms by which the front maintained its daily rhythm, by which the machinery of the line continued to function. The stand-to was normal. Its normalcy was the point. The 17th practice was the specific learned behavior of moving through communication trenches, supply lines, and no man's land at night. Night movement was central to the functioning of the front line because the daylight made above-ground movement suicidal. Rations were brought forward after dark. Wire was repaired after dark. Patrols went out after dark. Dead were recovered when recovery was possible. After dark, the movement was conducted in conditions of near-total blindness across terrain that was routinely compared by the men who traversed it to a nightmare landscape, because it had the specific quality of a nightmare, familiar enough to navigate, altered enough to disorient, full of hazards that could not be seen, capable of producing sudden death without warning. Men fell into shell craters filled with water. Men became lost in the featureless moonscape of no man's land and were found by the wrong people. Men became tangled in wire. Men were shot by their own sentries. The German army at Passchendaele in 1917 held a section of line in which the waterlogged ground had made conventional trenches impossible. Soldiers lived in shell craters connected by duckboard paths across open ground. Movement between positions required crossing sections of exposed terrain in which a misstep off the board sent a man into mud that was reported, in multiple accounts, to be deep enough to swallow a person entirely. At Passchendaele there are accounts of men drowning in shell craters filled with water and mud, of men falling off duckboards and sinking, of men who could not be reached in time. The mud at Passchendaele was not a metaphor, it was a tactical environment. Moving through it at night, carrying ammunition or food or the wounded, was a specific skill that the men who served there developed by necessity and that had no application anywhere else on earth. The 18th practice, and perhaps the most revealing of all that the war had become, was the acceptance of total institutional anonymity in death. This is where the machinery of the war reveals itself most completely. The great majority of the men who died in the First World War were processed through a system that was designed to record them and lost many of them anyway. The administrative apparatus of mass mobilization was genuinely unprecedented. Britain alone mobilized more than 5 million men, France mobilized 8 million, Germany over 11 million. The logistics of recording, tracking, supplying, treating, and burying these men strained the administrative capacity of every belligerent nation past its breaking point. When a man died in a quiet section of the line and was buried in a marked grave, and then subsequent shelling destroyed both the body and the marker, he became unknown. When a man died in the Somme offensive of 1916 and was struck directly by an artillery shell and ceased to exist as a coherent physical entity, he became unknown. When a man fell in no man's land and could not be retrieved, he became unknown. These were not individual failures of record-keeping. This was the outcome of war conducted at industrial scale with tools that were fully adequate to the task of killing and entirely inadequate to the task of accounting. The Thiepval Memorial in France carries the names of more than 72,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who died on the Somme between 1915 and 1918 and have no known grave. The Menin Gate carries nearly 55,000 names. The Tyne Cot Memorial near Passchendaele carries another 35,000. These are the named unknown, the men whose deaths were documented, even when their bodies were not. Behind them stand the truly anonymous, the men who could not be identified even by name, whose remains ended up in mass graves marked only with approximate unit affiliations or with no identification at all. One ossuary near Verdun holds the commingled remains of approximately 130,000 French and German soldiers, the bones sorted and stacked behind glass walls, the individuals inseparable. The soldiers who lived with this reality learned to carry it in a particular way. They learned not to dwell on the specific fate of specific men, because the specific fate of specific men was too much to carry. They learned a kind of operational detachment from individual death that was necessary for continued function. When a man in the section was killed, the section noted it and continued. When a man was seriously wounded and evacuated, the section noted it and continued. The work of the war did not pause for individual loss because the institutional logic of the war did not allow for it. The pace of attrition was too high. The replacement rate was too high. The continuity of the unit was maintained by filling the gaps with new men, and the new men arrived and took their places in the line, and the older men who watched them arrive understood what they were watching, the renewal of a pool that was being continuously drained by a system that had determined what the acceptable rate of drainage was. That determination, the calculation of the acceptable rate of casualties, was one of the defining characteristics of the First World War. As a managerial enterprise, it was not made cynically, in the sense of being made with clear-eyed awareness that the men being consumed were being consumed unnecessarily. It was made within the doctrinal and technological framework available to the men making it, a framework built before the war, tested against pre-industrial conditions, and applied to a conflict that had rendered most of its assumptions obsolete before the second year of fighting. The generals who sent men forward across no man's land into machine gun fire were not working outside the logic of their institutional context. They were the products of a system that had not yet developed adequate feedback mechanisms to recognize that its methods were not working. By the time the feedback arrived, it arrived in the form of 1 million dead. The men in the trenches knew what the generals did not. They knew it not from doctrine or from study, but from experience. They knew the exact range at which a machine gun was effective. They knew what a wire obstacle that had not been cut by artillery actually looked like at close range, as opposed to what the pre-attack briefing said it would look like. They knew that the communication systems that were supposed to coordinate the advance broke down within minutes of the whistles blowing and the men going over the top, because the telephone lines ran above ground and were cut by shell fire before the attack reached its first objectives. They knew that the artillery support was timed to a schedule that assumed a rate of advance that was not achievable across ground that had been churned into a wasteland. They knew all of this, and they went forward anyway, because the alternative was a firing squad, and because the men on either side of them were going forward, and because the war had been proceeding long enough that going forward was simply what you did when the whistle blew. The whistle was the technology of the First World War that has never been sufficiently remarked upon. It was how the order to advance was transmitted in conditions where no other means of communication could be heard above the noise. The officer blew the whistle. The men climbed the ladders. There was no ambiguity in the whistle. There was no space between hearing it and acting on it that could accommodate reflection. The training that had brought these men to this ladder had been designed precisely to eliminate that space. The obedience was conditioned, the advance was automatic, and then the machine guns began, and the automatic advance encountered a reality for which there was no automatic response. And the individual soldier, in the seconds between hearing the whistle and understanding what was happening to the men around him, was on his own. Some men lived, some men died. The ones who lived came back to the trench and cleaned their rifles and ate whatever food was available and tried to sleep. The next morning, Stand 2 was at dawn. The day after that, Stand 2 was at dawn. The week after, and the month after, and the year after. The armistice came on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. By that point, the Western Front had existed for over 4 years. The men who had survived it entire, who had been there from 1914 to 1918, had spent those years inside a system that had normalized their expendability, had categorized their psychological wounds as administrative inconveniences, had executed their comrades for the crime of breaking under conditions no human being was designed to endure, and had returned, at the end, to the process of counting and categorizing the cost with the same bureaucratic thoroughness with which it had always counted and categorized everything else. The war ended. The men went home. The ones who could not function were placed in institutions or lived quietly in the margins of peacetime society or died in their beds years later from conditions that the pension boards declined to attribute to war service. 65,000 British veterans were still receiving treatment for shell shock-related conditions in 1939, when the next war began. The ones who could speak, mostly, did not. The ones who could not speak were not asked. The world moved forward because the world had to move forward. The machine that had produced the war was still running. The institutional structures that had managed the war were still in place. The officers who had given the orders received their medals. The politicians who had prosecuted the war wrote their memoirs. And in the quiet villages of England and France and Germany and Belgium and Serbia and Austria, in the houses where the letters had stopped coming and the official notifications had arrived, in the spaces where the men who had not returned used to be, the world adjusted to the permanent fact of their absence. By November 1918, the war had produced approximately 17 million dead and 23 million wounded. The greatest single pandemic in recorded history, the influenza outbreak that had been moving through the wartime population since 1918, was still spreading, carried in part by the troop movements and the mass demobilizations that the end of the war required. The two things, the war and the pandemic, arrived in the same years and departed in the same years, and the world that emerged from them was different in every measurable way from the world that had entered them, and the difference was never fully named, and the men who had lived through the trenches lived in that unnamed difference for the rest of their lives, and they carried the 18 practices with them, worn smooth by repetition, no longer recognizable as extraordinary because they had been ordinary for too long, and the governments that had required those practices of them filed the relevant documents, closed the relevant cases, and moved forward into the next decade, which was already building the conditions for the next war, which would arrive in 21 years, which was not very long at all.